Hi, Elaine.
Hey,
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. You're good. You're feeling good. Last time I saw you, you were not feeling so great.
I'm much better now. Thank you.
It's great to see you, Elaine.
It's
And
great
thank
seeing
you
you,
for
Jennifer.
hosting.
No. All right, everyone. There's still people coming in, so I'm gonna wait a minute or two to let everyone keep coming in. Um, I want to make sure that all the panelists are in and the moderator. All right. Where is? If the panelists could unmute their screens so everyone can see who y'all are. All right. Oh my goodness. So I'm gonna get this meeting started. I think most of the people that are attending tonight are here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lane Benton. I founded the Colorful Life of RPCVs, and I'm extremely grateful to have four amazing volunteers to take time out of their days from different time zones to talk about a necessary conversation that we need to have in America right now, and that is misogyny, toxic masculinity, and then also learning what is positive masculinity from the perspective of women of color, because they're the most unprotected women, unprotected people currently across the globe, as we have seen here in the United States and in other countries. I have a few announcements to make. I want to first make an announcement that Local to Global Justice is an organization here in Phoenix, is a co-sponsor to this event, and they're also the financial sponsor for the Colorful Life of RPCVs. And so I'm going to be putting in a link in the chat for everyone to see. Donations are not expected, but they are appreciated. And all those donations will be going directly to the panelists tonight. And so there are, I believe, both of the founders of Local Global Justice are here, Dr. Beth Swagner and Dr. Jen Richter. If you could just wave, we would appreciate that. And so I also have one more announcement to make before passing it on to the moderator and Dominique tonight. I want to verbalize very clearly that this is a safe space and a brave space. It's a safe space for the volunteers to be vulnerable in front of everybody. Just like the last panel, there was a ton of people in this, or that attended, listening to 5 different panelists talking about very vulnerable experiences during their Peace Corps experience. Tonight is nothing different. Tonight may actually be more impactful than the last meeting, because this is something that is extremely necessary and is oftentimes overlooked. So if at any point in time there is a comment in the chat or somebody is doing anything inappropriate, I'm not going to ask you to stop. In fact, I'm going to remove you and then have a conversation with you afterwards to protect the panelists, because they are here voluntarily and they're not getting paid for their appearance except for via donations. So that is 100% transparent and clear. Any sexist remarks, anything like that, and you are gone. Sorry, it's kind of dark. It's got to be said, and it needs to be stated right away. So to lighten the mood, I'm going to pass this off to the moderator, Dominique. Dominique, could you introduce yourself?
Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Dominique Thurmond. I am an RPCV from the Dominican Republic. I served in the youth sector from 2017 until March of this year, when COVID ripped us away. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to be helping moderate this panel. And yeah, I think it's going to be a really fruitful discussion. So just a couple things that I wanted to acknowledge really quickly. First of all, it's the reason for the timing of this discussion. So we really wanted to be intentional and do this in the month of October. The reason for that being that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we, Lane and myself, and I say we, thought it would be really a good way to bring more awareness to that topic by discussing issues of misogyny and issues of toxic masculinity during this month. And then another thing that's actually going on for the month of October, and I'm just going to introduce this and pass it over to one of our panelists who can speak more about it, is, excuse me. Okay, so it's Peace Corps Survivor Awareness Month, which is a month that's being organized by Peace Corps HR and How I Saw Peace Corps, which are two organizations that you can follow on Instagram. And they're really just doing a month to focus on cultivating a space and bringing attention and resources to evacuated and returned volunteers who experience sexual harassment and assault. So one of our panelists, Zahada, can actually speak more about that. Zahada? That's okay. We can definitely come back to that. So basically we really wanted to just highlight the importance of creating spaces to discuss the issues that volunteers have experienced during their service. So yeah, that's really why we're here. And I just want to kind of reemphasize what Lane said about just letting this be a space where we can be open and we can be vulnerable and we are also respectful of one another. So with that said, we are going to move into a few panelists' introductions. So we're going to have the panelists say their name, their pronouns, a bit about their Peace Corps service, and why they think it's important to have a conversation about toxic masculinity. I see Elizabeth, so we can start with you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here and for hearing out this, I think, important conversation. I served in Morocco from 2017 until 2019. And I lived in the Northeast region, Middle Atlas kind of mountains of Morocco. I absolutely love my experience and the community that I made there. But of course, it came with many challenges that I often felt were ignored or dismissed by, most unfortunately, I believe, staff and as well as other volunteers that perhaps didn't have the same experiences as female volunteers of color. And so I think it's really important to have this conversation, especially now when I think we are experiencing almost on a daily basis the effects of toxic masculinity and letting that go unchecked and not addressed correctly. So I hope this is a fruitful conversation for everyone.
Okay, so it looks like Zahada is having some internet issues. So we will have our other panelist, Kriti.
Hi, I'm Kriti. I served in Guinea from 2019 to evacuation as an education volunteer. And yeah, I too echo a lot of the same feelings that Elizabeth shared with us. Also very appreciative of the fact that everyone's here and everyone's willing to listen to this very important discussion, I think. I think toxic masculinity and misogyny have always been important conversations, though I think now in a sort of heightened time that we're living in, this, especially in this country, I think it's becoming a more and more important conversation that we need to have, and it's something that can no longer go unchecked. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to what I hope will be a very fruitful discussion.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move forward. So we do have some pre-written questions, but I just want to say that as we kind of move through these questions, if there are other things that you, I guess, as the audience or anyone would like to have as part of the discussion, definitely feel free to put those in the chat or chat them directly to Lane, but he'll be keeping his eyes out for those. Okay, so the main kind of theme that we are really here discussing is toxic masculinity. So it's really important for us to have kind of a base level knowledge of what that means and really what that is for us. So I just want to have a conversation about what is toxic masculinity. So I found a really good definition from it's a project called the Good Men Project that addresses masculinity. I would like to share with you all. Toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of men, designating manhood as defined by violence, sex, status, and aggression. It is the cultural ideal of manliness, where strength is everything while emotions are a weakness, where sex and brutality are yardsticks by which men are measured, while supposedly feminine traits, which can range from emotional vulnerability to simply not being hypersexual, are the means by which your status as men can be taken away. So my question to the panelists is, do you feel like that definition encompasses how you view toxic masculinity, or is there anything that you would like to add to that?
Thank you for that definition. I think I 100% agree with how it describes it. I think I also kind of wrote down that it was a socially constructed view that dictates the way that masculinity is expressed and the role that men, broadly speaking, play in our society.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the key word there is how narrow it is and how unavailable it is for expression, and steering away from that, as Preeti said, socially constructed definition. I think it's spot on.
Yeah, I definitely like the use of the words narrow and repressive, because I think that while toxic masculinity definitely affects people who don't identify as men, it also affects men as well. And I think it kind of limits their ability to express themselves fully and to pursue the things that they're interested in some cases. And yeah, I think it kind of hurts us all in that way. So the next question, as of course is as usual, is tell us a time when you experienced toxic masculinity during your Peace Corps service.
So in my service, there were many a time where I experienced toxic masculinity, but I'll talk about a few, I guess. I think the obvious one is obviously marriage proposals. Still a lot of marriage proposals, and having to deal with like rejecting those marriage proposals. The second one was more in the school that I was teaching in. So it was very common for teachers, all the teachers in my school, were men, to marry their young female students, right? These were young women and girls who were just, high schoolers. And that kind of being brought on to me with a lot of my young men students trying to become friends with me and thinking that maybe they would have the same prospects with me, and having to navigate that very difficult relationship in terms of like, no, I'm your teacher, I'm not here to do that, and that's not like, I don't want that relationship with you. And also like having trouble, I think, calling out how uncomfortable it made me that like students were marrying their teachers, and in a culture that I obviously could not change, but could only really have like one-on-one conversations with people. Another one was people would often like judge my position as a woman. So like, being that I'm American, a lot of people thought that like maybe I'm like too westernized or too like, I don't want to use the word emancipated, but that's the first word that comes to mind. And so they would doubt my ability to do housework and say that like, you are unable to like serve a man, so you're not worthy of being a wife, i.e. like getting married. Again, something that I've really had to like call out unapologetically and say that no, like I don't at least don't treat me that way. I feel really bad that like other women feel that that is the world that a woman must live in. But I mean, and then I guess in terms of like a man's role, things that I noticed were like a lot of men in the community that I was in were the primary breadwinners in their families, and so like feeling like they have to provide for a woman because a woman is unable to provide for herself, and in that way, and then feeling really inadequate when they were unable to fulfill those financial responsibilities for their families, and not really knowing what to do. That was those are kind of the main ones that I experienced.
And I think I can echo exactly what Kriti said. Apart from the sexual harassment that I think many volunteers experience, there was that dismissiveness that I wasn't capable of being in a professional role. I mostly taught English at our youth center, and kind of not having tasks delegated to me because it was seen as I was seen as incapable, or they'd rather have these tasks delegated to if another American volunteer was near me and he was male, they would rather have him take on those roles. Not only that, but when a project was completed and we would have these sort of celebratory occasions, completely dismissing my role in whatever played out. And not just my role, but other women from the community that partook in a project. It was very celebratory for men that were not even involved, and just kind of so dismissive. I have to say that also in Morocco, space is very gendered. Where people gather, and it's very segregated, but I had to learn that that wasn't necessarily always a negative thing for people in the community. That was their chosen safe spaces, and having to realize that men didn't have permission to certain spaces, and that was totally okay. And not having to force yourself into certain spaces that aren't for you, I think was such a learning curve for me.
Great. No, thank you. I'm like hearing that and like thinking in so many ways of my own service, and just thinking of, it just made me think of times when I was living alone, and a man would say, oh, like, how can you live alone? Like, you need someone to be doing this for you. You need someone to be helping you in this way. So yeah, it's just like interesting to hear like how similar sometimes the experiences can be. I believe, Zahada, are you available? I just wanted to check in and see if you wanted to share anything on the question of experience of toxic masculinity in service. That's all right. Okay. So moving on kind of to the next idea here. So one thing that I think is really worth noting is that when we talk about toxic masculinity, we're talking about like an extension, or like a hyper form of masculinity, right? So masculinity in and of itself is not bad. So it's really important to talk about how, how can we delineate between toxic masculinity and healthier, more positive forms of masculinity.
And I should say this was also something new for me, that I had to, in a way, unlearn a lot of the things that I myself had grown up learning. One common trope that I remember realizing how harmful it was is hearing boys don't cry. if something would go wrong at a youth activity, and I would hear that constantly, and knowing how harmful that is to everyone involved, but again, especially the young boy that is being told to completely put those emotions aside because you should not be feeling that, and you should feel worse for feeling that. And I would say, you know, that's something that to this day I'm still learning or having to unlearn. What I've been told is, or what I've been told to ignore and not really a problem. Another thing I can think of is locker room talk. You know, it wasn't really addressed. What's not being said in my presence doesn't affect me, but it very much does. And while I may not be present in all of those conversations that are being had in more private spaces between men, knowing that that is very harmful for people that aren't in those spaces, and they have real consequences by letting comments and locker room talk kind of go ignored and continue to be accepted. And even if you're not partaking in it, by not saying anything, how harmful that is. Yeah, I don't know if that completely answered the question, but I'll let also Kriti if she has something to add.
No, I think that I echo a lot of the same sentiments. I feel like I kind of had a more general delineation between the two. So for me, like sort of along the same lines, toxic masculinity is feeling forced by society, obviously, to accept what is considered the status quo, and accepting that without really critiquing it, right? I think as men, like in the broad sense, as they age and see more of the world, I think not being able to have space to critique that and really reflect on it is very harmful. And then positive masculinity, again, kind of the opposite of that. Recognizing, again, that masculinity can be expressed in different forms, right? And there's no right or wrong way to be masculine. And that kind of resulting in behaviors that kind of more adhere to someone just trying to be their authentic self and not trying to adhere to the standards that we have in place in our society. In terms of sorry, I had one more thought. In terms of the crying thing, the crying point you brought up, Elizabeth, yeah, in Guinea also, like a lot of the folks that I interacted with, like crying, for me, from what I understand, it seemed like crying was something that like anyone could do, and that was okay to cry. But if it was a man, like you don't really talk about the fact that you just cried, and the fact that like a man would cry was like kind of like an event that you talk about, something that like shouldn't normally happen, but it happened, and now we're going to talk about an event that happened. So like when I left, like I was told like kind of explicitly, like, you know, like that my host dad had cried, and I was like, okay, like it's normal to cry, like me too, like I cried too, like I don't know why this is so like odd. And then, you know, kind of realizing that after having heard other incidences before, being like, oh, okay, like that's just like something that is kind of, I guess, embarrassing, and not something that a man should talk about.
Also, Elizabeth, I just really love that point of you saying that you also had to unlearn this mindset around it, because I do think that in some ways we all kind of absorb these ideas, and in some instances we also can recreate them and put them on others, even unwittingly and unknowingly. So it's definitely something that we all need to be thinking about. So I thought that was a really good point. So as we kind of dig deeper into the idea of a more positive masculinity, the question that I have is, what do forms of positive masculinity look like to you? Have you experienced it? Do you have any specific examples?
The question was what forms of positive masculinity I have seen, and yeah, sure. I did experience some great moments of between other volunteers, and also I have to say community members speaking up when for example, harassment was being said towards myself or another PCV. And not only standing up, because sometimes that can escalate a certain risk or escalate the harassment, but asking, what do you prefer, if anything, I do? Sometimes you just wanted to walk away. Sometimes you just wanted to get away from a situation that you didn't feel safe in. And sometimes that was preferred. And having that just be asked and not feeling like someone else was going to just take charge of a situation and make you feel like they were going to like protect you or whatnot was what was needed at that moment. Knowing that I can't stand up for myself, but also I don't need someone else to. I just need you to ask if you can do something or what you can do in a situation. Also seeing volunteers be the first to be uncomfortable. That goes further than just, stepping up if there is harassment and asking. But again, I guess leading back to that example of locker room talk, not just letting it go by, especially when no one is there to see your action and your allyship. It's not performative. It's very much you saying something and not allowing that conversation to continue and ignoring it. It's so easy to ignore. It's so easy to not partake in it and be dismissive as well as of other people. It's a lot more harder, and it takes a lot more work to be uncomfortable and say something and potentially risk your relationships that you have built in your community. So when volunteers did that, it was, I think, what was needed, and some forms of positive masculinity by addressing it, not ignoring it, and being uncomfortable.
Yeah, I agree with, I 100% echo everything that you just said, Elizabeth. I just wanted to add, like, so where I served, like, polygamy was really common. So it was often like men had multiple wives. And there were a lot of, like, at least in my host family, like, they all like actively called it out and were like, we don't think that's okay. And like, we're completely against all of that kind of behavior. And like, it was really refreshing to see like them also like actively calling out other men who would pursue multiple women at the same time and be like, you can't do that. Like, that's not how you treat people. And I think that was really uplifting to see, and really, like, I was really happy to hear that was happening.
Yeah, I really liked how you both mentioned just the idea of a man kind of pushing back on something a little bit and kind of questioning it, or kind of being like, oh, well, maybe you shouldn't do that, or like, why do you do that? I think even that simple act of just like not letting something fly can be so powerful in so many different contexts. So I definitely agree there.
I wanted to add one more thing in regards to, I think one of my favorite experiences was I was feeling, again, like really professionally dismissed oftentimes in projects, and working with other volunteers as well that were male, and having my voice just kind of be dismissed, knowing when to just be quiet and pass the mic, especially to women from the community, and also again to other female PCVs or non-gender conforming PCVs, of just having men know when it's not their turn to talk and when they truly wouldn't have more to add than their counterparts, was refreshing to see, and I think such a positive form of practicing and putting in action that a positive trait of masculinity.
Perfect. Thank you, for sure. Okay, so, and if you have any, what are some tips that you would give someone to practice positive masculinity? I know we kind of touched on this, but if you have any kind of specific tips.
I kind of touched on it, I guess, in what I just mentioned, but I think one other thing that I learned as well in my service, especially I was doing youth development work, which is really broad. Oftentimes that meant teaching English and doing like physical activities and being creative in that. And not only finding ways to from time to time bring in like gender specific curriculum, but making that a core part of your whatever activities you're doing. There are ways to incorporate that and to make it as a core part, not just a supplemental I guess, lessons in whatever you're doing or whatever programming. But I think as volunteers, it should be a core part of our curriculum that we're developing in our communities and collaborating with people from our communities, because again, in a place especially like Morocco, but I think this can be said about any country of service, gender roles are quite different than what perhaps we might have experienced in the States. And culturally, I think to be respectful, there's no way we can do it on our own. It should very much be developed with women or folks that are not gender conforming from the community, and making sure that their voices are heard and amplifying their voices. So as PCVs, I think it is our duty to make sure that's part of our curriculum.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think the more that we can also, I think trying to understand the role, the gendered roles that exist, not that exist in one's country of service, I think is really important, because like I knew a lot of really strong women who were like very like vocal in their own way, but maybe not vocal in the way that I would view a vocal, confident woman. And so that was a really interesting thing for me to kind of unpack and understand and be like, wait, and be present in situations where I was like, I would never have like acted in this way had I been in your shoes. I'm gonna say something that might be triggering for people, so please like log out and come back in if you'd like to. I witnessed 2 times domestic violence in my compound where I lived, and again, I felt really helpless in those situations because I was just like, oh my goodness, this is like terrible. And in both instances, you know, people in the community were like, there they go again, like, this is so normalized here, like you can hit anyone here. It's like, okay, well, all right. And in both of those instances, the women who were survivors of this violence forgave their partners, and I was just like, what? It was very surprising to me that one would forgive someone for committing an act of violence like that. And it was just like an interesting way to view a woman's empowerment and saying that, okay, well, maybe, you know, I can come to a place of forgiveness. But yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to add to that.
No, and thank you so much for sharing that. I kind of want us to maybe take a step back and think about the conversation that we've had in general, and thinking about the themes that we're looking at, and thinking about our Peace Corps service and how it related to our identity, and really think about our things that we feel like Peace Corps could have done to support us better during service.
I kind of echoed this throughout my service as well, but I think more so afterwards, because one thing that I always was fearful of was getting medically evac'd for expressing my stress over being in my community. And this kind of idea of integrate at whatever cost was really embedded in us as volunteers. However, I quickly realized that that is that looks different for every volunteer, but especially for female volunteers and volunteers of color, that can oftentimes be dangerous. I remember kind of hearing these stories when PCVs were together with staff of what they have done to integrate. One story was of this white volunteer who just went, let their family take her to this unknown location. She slept there in the middle of all these women and children, and it was a positive story for her, but just kind of very much, and it was paraded by staff as like, see, this is such a great example of doing whatever it takes, as uncomfortable as you are, to integrate, and kind of having this idea that the more integrated you are, the more successful you will be as a volunteer. And kind of realizing that I don't think I would ever feel safe in being asked to do that. And knowing that, one, as a volunteer of color, where people kind of question my identity and would kind of bring out tropes and of what they thought I was and who they thought I was, and kind of that can escalate to simple comments or harassment to actually getting rocks thrown at you, or not being respected where your safety was in danger, or having people think they can approach you in a hostile way because they don't think that you are actually American, and not placing a sort of kind of a level of respect that they might show other volunteers, male volunteers, but also female white volunteers. And so knowing that, kind of having that fear and having to swallow that if I bring anything up, I might be dismissed by staff, but also they can easily think I'm not up to the task and be medically evac. And unfortunately, I did see that, especially from Black female volunteers, kind of them not just getting dismissed, but also being medically evac'd, and having them kind of having their voices be viewed as, or their concerns are very real concerns, not only not be taken seriously, but viewed as complaining, and how harmful that was to all PCVs, I think, to see, but again, especially female PCVs of color that have this kind of like, now it's solidified, I won't be taken seriously, and I might just be viewed as I'm complaining, or I might be medically evac'd, which I don't want to leave, but I need more support and I need more help. So the first thing off the top of my head that Peace Corps can do is bring in trained professionals, especially for volunteers of color, to have a safe space. And I think something that's so harmful, and I don't understand why Peace Corps does not have this in place and kind of use it as harmful, because I think it's so necessary. I think addressing mental health, and also Peace Corps still has a stigma against serving volunteers that have a history of mental health concerns. I think that's just so outdated and it's obsolete. It needs to definitely be addressed on a policy level, because the issues that volunteers face, especially mental health issues, are very real, and oftentimes I'd rather stay silent and suffer silently for 2 years, because I really do love what I'm doing and I find value in what I'm doing, but I'm fearful of expressing the very real fears and concerns I have for potentially being medically evac'd.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth. That was, I echo some similar sentiments. Yeah, I think also to add to the mental health conversation, I think having all medical staff know the trauma-informed approach to medical care is so important, because everybody in some way, in some realm of their life, has experienced some sort of trauma, and it's so important to, like, whether that be as a result of Peace Corps service or externally, I think that you'd rather like not call the PCMO and be like, hi, I'm sick, for fear of being like kind of laughed at and made fun of for being like, I'm sick, I'm not feeling well, and try to figure it out on your own and maybe have it go on for longer than it needed to because you didn't want to make that call. I think also kind of on more of the diversity and inclusion front, at least in my country of service, like our trainings were not adequate at all. They need to be in depth, they need to be updated, they need to be critical, they need to address the white savior complex, they need to address international development and the harms that it historically has done and continues to do. And I think also the representation of volunteers needs to change. My stage was 95% white. It was very uncomfortable. And I think if we're able to change that diversity, like it would be easier for particularly volunteers of color to know the experience of a volunteer of color, right? Because while of course everyone's experience is different, if there's no way for anyone to really know anything and you're going in with no expectations and no knowledge, then if you speak up and try to say something, you don't want to be like penalized for it because because of course you may have a general overall positive experience with your service, but it's definitely more support for volunteers of color and volunteers from other marginalized groups.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so this is the last question, and some of the things have already kind of been touched on, but just if there are any kind of specific comments on this specific question, it is, how can Peace Corps support aspiring volunteers? So more so thinking about for people who might be interested in joining Peace Corps or maybe going through the process, like the application process, or might be like in the recruiting pool. Are there anything specifically that Peace Corps could or should be doing to kind of support or educate those folks?
Yeah, I have one very shocking thing that I discovered recently is that Peace Corps doesn't collect aggregated data on volunteer diversity. Instead, all volunteers from any marginalized group get clumped together as minority. And if you're applying to a program that often provides social mobility for folks from marginalized groups, you need to know the percentage of your people who identify similarly to you that are there, right? And if that's not there, then you don't feel welcome, and that's an environmental microaggression. Yeah, I think that was the main thing. And then also just knowing better how Peace Corps can support volunteers, especially survivors, and knowing that there is mental health support available for them. And then also last one, providing really strict guidelines for do's and don'ts for social media. And I saw a lot of volunteers do really problematic things, and making that a really central discussion.
Yeah, and I would have to agree also with what Kriti said about better training for all volunteers that are incoming stages or groups. Not having just supplemental trainings that are optional on race and also gender, but making that a core part of Peace Corps training development. It's not okay anymore that it's just supplemental and optional, because volunteers can suffer very much during their service, and making sure that their voices are amplified. I think also having more outreach from recruiters of color and also for volunteers. And again, it's not just simply outreaching more, but also making sure that your organization is ready to accept and address the issues that we have voiced. So I think it's harmful to invite volunteers of color with having very real issues in these communities and in these countries, and of racism and harassment, and just inviting them without addressing what Peace Corps can do as an organization in these countries. It's more than just outreaching and inviting more PCVs of color. I think it's also addressing this and having a plan of action before you invite. I wouldn't say before, but as you invite volunteers, having a solid plan of action of what staff on the management level will do when these problems arise of racism and harassment and physical assault.
Thank you. Yeah, I really agree with that point. I think a lot about that quote that's like, we don't want to integrate people into a burning house, right? So we also have to think about, it is important for Peace Corps volunteers to be representative, right, of our society and of the diversity that we have in our country, but we also need to make sure that Peace Corps as an organization is prepared to really kind of accept those challenges and grow into the organization that can express that diversity in like a really safe way. Perfect. Okay, so that was our last pre-written question. I just want to open it up if anyone has any questions or anything that they would like to kind of add or kind of discuss at all from anyone.
Well, I put a, this is Beth from Local to Global Justice, ASU, Justice Studies faculty, and so on. I just put a comment in that I've so appreciated that your willingness to share really intimate and personal experiences that I think echo experiences of probably many of us, whether we've served in the Peace Corps or not. I've spent much of my career in sub-Saharan Africa and many cross-cultural experiences over the last 30 years, including doing an unlearning oppression workshop for Peace Corps volunteers and local staff in Accra and 2 other rural locations in Ghana several years ago. And I remember in that experience that the staff supporting the program were quite intrigued with the idea that these issues even needed to be addressed. You know, some of them really identified with some of the issues we're talking about, because this was a workshop about multiple forms of oppression that included heteronormativity and heterosexism, and included racism, certainly, and sexism, and ableism. I'm glad you touched on that, with hidden disabilities like mental health and the, you know, we better avoid that or they're going to lose it when they're overseas attitude that I'm afraid is still pretty pervasive. So I don't know, I'm rambling, but it's just really an appreciation for the nuances that you brought to these issues, and you know, this tension between cultural relativity and you have to accept certain practices. I mean, I of course work with well, not of course, but I do work with people who are practicing polygamy, I mean, and I work with, you know, very well, communities that are doing things that, as a Western feminist, that I certainly am quite critical of. And it's always a challenge to kind of mediate some of those perceptions and tease out what is your own internalized cultural assumptions about the ways things should be, versus when things just aren't right. You know, when you're witnessing intimate partner, domestic violence, and other examples. So I'll mute myself, as I would say in one of my own classes, with that appreciation. I just think you've teased out a lot of the complexities, and I hope this information gets shared with those in Washington and other places who, you know, are running things in Peace Corps once it gets out in the world again.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. I just wanted to add to that and say that, like, all the things that we're addressing also affect host country communities, right? And if Peace Corps wants to be a better organization, not just for volunteers from marginalized groups, but for the communities that we serve in, it's so important to consider the tension also that often exists between host country national staff and American hired staff, especially white American hired staff, and just the problematic nature of those relationships that are just that can cause a lot of problems. And if we don't, we're talking a lot about volunteers, but I think that these same issues affect the people that work for Peace Corps on the ground, and we have to do it for them too. Like, and they should be the central voice in this conversation, actually.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that this continues to be a learning process for me as well. I'm about a year out of my service from Morocco, but I still keep kind of these lessons still keep reappearing. As you were talking about, Beth, a little bit about like my own cultural bias that I had when I served in Morocco, of feeling like being so confused and perplexed by the kitchen being dominated and not being a space for men, and at first being so against that, and being upset by that, and then learning like this is a chosen space where women feel free and empowered, and they have chosen to have this space for themselves and create something beautiful there for themselves. And very much, again, learning that cultural bias, that just because it's done differently doesn't mean it's wrong, and can actually have such a beautiful lesson of cultural empowerment that women make for themselves. And again, I'm sure in every country we can see these and we can learn these lessons and still apply them to our lives now, however many years we're not PCVs anymore, but knowing that there's real meaning in the chosen spaces that people create for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also kind of just drawing on that as well. I just love the idea that we're kind of all in this learning space together, right? And we are all growing, we're all learning, and like the panelists, we're all people who did Peace Corps, we're already back home or back somewhere else, and we're still learning and growing and trying to make sense of these ideas and these experiences. So I definitely think it's not easy, right? It's not something that can be done in a day, but it's really important to really have those spaces. Okay, I just want to hold space if there's anyone else who wants to speak. I know there's a couple comments in the chat, but if anyone wants to say anything to the group, I just want to hold some space for that. Oh. And look at Elizabeth's puppy. Okay. Well, if no one has anything else, I'd have a couple last minute announcements. So we did have another panelist that is having some really serious internet issues going on. So I will just drop in the chat the link to the organization that they, or like to the Instagram page for the organization that they're involved with. And you can definitely check that out. They are one of the organizations that's co-running Peace Corps Survivors Month. So I will be sure to share that. And then the next thing from Lane is that there is going to be a post-panel survey that Lane is about to drop in the chat right now. So it would be really useful. I don't know how much you all know about Lane and the organization that he's working on, but this was presented by an organization called The Colorful Life of RPCVs. And Lane is the founder. He's a friend as well. He is a RPCV from the Dominican Republic. And yeah, this is like something that he's just doing on his own totally. So any information, any response, any feedback is super useful to him as we kind of move forward with this project and plan more activities and events and different things to kind of highlight the experiences of RPCVs of color. So don't leave until you fill out the survey.
Thank you so much, Dom. Like Dom said, we had another panelist that was supposed to join in. I've been trying to work with them all the entire panel to get them access. Drop the bottle. Bad news. Just kidding. So the plan moving forward then is, because we weren't able to get the third panelist's opinions and thoughts and their expertise on some of the topics tonight, is we're either going to be having a one-on-one conversation with them via Zoom or via Instagram. The organization that Zahara works for is on every social media platform, and they do a lot of Instagram interviews. I think, Kirti, you had an interview with How I Saw Peace Corps, and it was very productive and needed. So it's unfortunate that we were supposed to go to 7, but we didn't have all the panelists and couldn't get everyone involved. So we can end it here early. But I did want to say that if you can fill out the survey, we would greatly appreciate it moving forward with different panels, and also to learn from this panel. 2, you do not have to donate. We're not expecting any donations. They are just greatly appreciated, because these volunteers took an hour out of the time and are in different time zones. I saw that there are 2 Peace Corps officials, 3 Peace Corps officials that are from the Dominican Republic here tonight. So, we got people from different countries, different states. We greatly appreciate it. And my last announcement is that we have a third panel in discussions and in the works right now. And the topic for that one is how my sexual orientation and my sexuality impacted my service. Right now, we just think that as an organization, we need to be a better ally and to allow everyone to speak on their hardships and challenges in Peace Corps based on your sexual orientation. We've talked about toxic masculinity and misogyny. We've talked about what it means to be an ally from the perspective of a person of color. We had 2 Black folks, we had 2 Latinx folks, we had a Chinese American in there speaking of what an allyship means. And so that was powerful. We had these 2 amazing panelists that picked up a lot tonight. Thank you so much. And then this next panel is going to be, in my aspirations, the most impactful to this point. As we go forward with every panel, we want them to be more powerful and more impacting and more educational, coming from the community, coming from people who live these experiences. And so be on the lookout for more information for that. We will get the promotions and whatnot going here shortly, permitting that school allows for the plan. School and courses allows for everyone to plan and work because we all have lives. And then lastly, I want to thank each and every one of you for attending tonight. And some of you I've seen attended the first one too. So to attend 2 panels and to truthfully listen to what everybody is saying and to take that and put it from words into praxis or to apply it to what you are doing with the Peace Corps is so impactful for all of us here at the Colorful Lives of RPCVs, especially since we want to make a change and we want to make Peace Corps better for volunteers of color. And who else is better to explain our experiences and our challenges than volunteers of color? So with that being said, last thing, just like the first panel, I want to take a moment of silence to acknowledge that we are on indigenous lands, settler colonialism, and I want to take a moment of silence for the women that have lost their lives to domestic violence, the men and women that have lost their lives to police brutality and other forms of systemic oppression. with that being said, y'all, thank you so much for attending. It truly means a lot to us here at the Colorful Life of RPCVs, and we look forward to see you at the next panel. Have a great night. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I think you all have my email via the Zoom registration link. And anything else, reach out to me on there. Have a good night, everyone.